Now I move everything. What an annoying man I am. There we are. Well, welcome. Thank you for being here. Lovely to have the company. And we're going to look at what we sometimes call Holy Week. I know it's a few weeks off, but the preparations for Holy Week, for Good Friday, for Easter itself, of course, do begin next week with in 2 weeks' time with Ash Wednesday. So I thought it'd be good to sort of prelude that with some thinking about what happened, but in my usual quirky way, from the inside out, trying to get alongside the people who were there. What did they think was happening? What did they make of it all? And the week begins in Bethany, and I'm going to take it as far as Calvary. And then we will leave the Easter celebrations and the Easter story to your individual churches. So what we are doing, not for the first time, friends, is going time and space travelling. And we have to allow ourselves the privilege of making that jump of 2,000 miles going east to the Holy Land, and of course 2,000 years back. And in doing that, we've got to try and just set aside, it's very difficult, but set aside a lot of our 21st century assumptions and presumptions, because they will get in the way of us really understanding the message of the Bible in the day that it was all happening, but then recognizing, of course, that the message that comes out of all that happened in those biblical times is timeless. And that's why it's relevant for us today. So, first of all, I wanted to try and get our bearings a bit. Some of you will be familiar with this, but just to look again at a map there, and I'll pick out the significant things. Here's Galilee up in the north. That's Lake Galilee just about there. And we've got Samaria there, which is a bit of a no-go area. They didn't get on very well with the rest of them. And then way down here, we're going to get to Jerusalem. And this area, Perea, very conservative, very traditional, in sharp contrast to this little region here, Decapolis, which is actually Greek for 10 cities. And there, they were very much influenced by foreign cultures, particularly the Greek cultures. So we're obviously going to be focusing more down here, but a lot of the people who will be travelling during that week in order to get to Jerusalem in time for Passover would have come many, many a mile and travelled many days to get there. And they bring their own insights and experiences as well. So a closer look here, of course, at this time, we're just moved out of when Herod the Great, last time I was speaking with you, of course, we were looking at the Christmas story, and it was Herod the Great. He died probably in the year 4 BC, and he wanted to keep things in the family, so his sons took over the reign. When I say sons, I mean he did have 13 wives, so how he got time to rule as well, I don't know, but some of those sons took it in turns. Some of them were a disaster, and the Romans kicked them out. But it ended up with Herod Antipas. Remember that name? He comes up later. And he was overseeing in the Galilee area. Across on this side was his half-brother Philip. And because the other brothers made a bit of a mess of it, 2 of them got kicked out, the Romans essentially were looking after the rest of it. So there were different people involved in the oversight. Philip was much more easygoing and liberal. Herod was much more following in his father's footsteps and was not particularly popular. Herod Antipas, in fact, was responsible for the death of John the Baptist, remember. That's the character we're talking about, up in the Galilee area, where, of course, Jesus did a lot of his ministry, his public ministry. So we get a bit of a feel of what's going on there. This is just to remind you how difficult it was travelling about, and I'll come back to that a little bit later. But in order to get, for example, from Galilee, and it was a real thing for Galileans to go to Jerusalem. You know, we're talking about a 7-day journey on foot. Donkey, if you're lucky, take 10 days on donkey. But more seriously, if you wanted to get from up in the Galilee there, down to Jerusalem there, you couldn't go on a straight line, at least high risk going. You wanted to avoid Samaria, and ideally you didn't really want to go through Decapolis if you were what we might today call an Orthodox Jew, as opposed to a liberal one. So you sort of skirted round there, you came down on the east side of the Jordan, and then at Jericho you crossed over and made your way up to Jerusalem. So it wasn't a direct route. As the crow flies, it's about 90 miles, but the actual route you'd take in order to be in friendlier territory. I wouldn't say entirely friendly, because there was still plenty of risks on the way. You may remember I was saying at Christmas, or last November, when we were looking at the Christmas story, that you didn't travel alone or even in couples. You always travelled with a group for safety. So let's get our heads around who we are thinking about here. What do we know about the ordinary people? And at that time, there was certainly a very strong national identity. We wanted to be identified for who we are. And that strength of identity comes when you are being ruled by a foreign and ungodly nation. You want to stick together. I mean, you can translate that into modern times. Those peoples who are being oppressed at the moment stick together all the more because of the oppressor. So strong national identity. There was a respect for God's law. I'm going to put my tongue in the cheek and say, when it suited them. I mean, there were an enormous number of foreign influences, some of which they found attractive and were fairly all right. Others they found attractive and was certainly not in keeping with God's law. So there was a bit of a tension there. There was most certainly, though, a resentment, a real hatred and fear of the occupying force. But they couldn't do anything. They were weak. They weren't allowed to, in any way challenge the Roman oppressors. Well, at least you could challenge them, but you only did it once. And they were equally concerned, to put it mildly. They despised those who were leading them, who were the chief priests, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, who were oppressive in a different sort of way, demanding they do various things, demanding, and in fact they couldn't agree amongst themselves. There were all sorts of debates which would go on within the leadership, the Jewish leadership, the religious leadership, about what was right or wrong. One example, you've probably heard about a Sabbath day's journey. How far could you go on the Sabbath? Well, there are different schools of thought. In fact, if you go to Jerusalem today, you'll actually see from the city centre, depending where you're viewing, that just within sight you'll see some very tall poles which actually mark the distance from the city centre, or the temple, to the end of a Sabbath day journey. You could travel that far. Beyond that, you were sinning because you were doing work, you were doing something that was not necessary. But they couldn't agree on where to put those poles. They didn't actually put poles up back in biblical times. But there was actually a Jewish writing that records 4 rabbis having a debate about where a Sabbath day journey ended. Well, for the ordinary people, come on, just trying to live their lives. All sorts of other things going on, and as we will discover later, corruption. I sometimes call it, I think I have here, haven't I? Yes. Did they despise Herod the Great? They weren't too thrilled about those that followed him, particularly Herod Antipas, and they certainly didn't like what I call the temple mafia, because it was a family that were looking after all that happened in the temple. We'll come back to that a little bit later. So, a little bit more about national identity, which was such a strong thing for, as I say, an oppressed people rely, one of the ways they keep together is what makes us who we are. Well, of course, they could trace their heritage, if you like, and their oneness, their really coming together, right back to the times of slavery and then coming out of Egypt and slavery. And from then onwards, they didn't really have many times of independence, of actually being a nation themselves. They were either wandering and feeling that they had lost identity, but they hadn't got land either. And of course, land is important. We have to say, well, these are the borders, these are ours. We can do our thing in here. We're protected by our borders. A wandering people can't do that. And it wasn't until those years, way back in 164 BC, that a priestly family, the Hasmones, something known as the Hasmonean period, that they were in charge, and they brought stability, they brought security, and they brought confidence back. And the most important thing, the identity that we are a Jewish people, we are who we are, we can identify ourselves. And that meant so much to them. That period of being able to regain their distinctive identity. Jews were telling Jews what to do. There was a revival in the Hebrew language. Again, a wandering people, you have to pick up all sorts of languages, all sorts of cultures, all sorts of influences. Some acceptable, some certainly not. And from that period, which of course is not too long, it's only a generation or two before the period we're talking about now, in Jesus' time, there was this rise in nationalism and independence. Until, of course, the Romans arrived in 63 BC. And became more and more dominant. You have to remember, actually, that as far as the Romans were concerned, this was a sort of the end of their territory, of their empire. It was a bit out on a limb. Nonetheless, it was theirs, and they brought their mode of rule, they brought their traditions, they brought things like demanding tribute to Caesar, not just financial, but the Romans themselves, of course, regarded their emperors as gods, to be worshipped and venerated. So once again, the Jews had lost their identity. They were again an oppressed people. Language is an interesting thing. Language is an identifier, isn't it? People are very often proud of their language, don't like it being misused. It also is ways in which you can express yourself with particular turns of phrase and so on. A number of you here, I know, have very supportive of our Ukrainian friends, and commend them for the way that they are working hard to learn English. But by golly, we trip them up with some of our phrases, don't we? And just finding the nuances of words and phrases and so on. But language is important. And in the case of the folk we're talking about at this time, there were 4 languages floating about. Aramaic, you can think of as the language of the people, the everyday language. There were dialects as well. If you came from Galilee, in the same way as if you came from Yorkshire in this country, you'd know it. Other people would recognize that. There was Hebrew, which was very much a common language, but also it was a holy language. The scriptures were written in Hebrew. As you probably know, you would never, when Jesus was reading in the synagogue, reading from the scriptures, obviously he knew Hebrew, then you wouldn't touch the pages. You had a special little stick to turn the pages with, because the language and the words there were considered sacred. Greek then was the universal language. You wander around Jerusalem, any of the big cities, it would be Greek that you would hear. And Latin was around. That wasn't a spoken language, or everyday language, even for the Romans. But they would use it in the Senate, in legal proceedings, in courts, in both the legal courts and also the court of the emperor. In Jerusalem, when Pontius Pilate was there, it'd be used in his presence, and all military communications were in Latin. So you might hear the soldiers going by chanting, "Sinister dextra, sinister dextra, sinister dextra." Left, right, left, right, left, right. They probably had some other Latin phrases as well, but we won't go into that. So, I think by now you may well have picked up some of the tension that is going on. There's a yearning to be free from oppression. Although there wouldn't have been any people who were living back in the Hasmonean time, they would have had handed down the stories of the glorious time when we were free. And that had gone. And of all the oppressors they had, the Romans were the most organized and the most oppressive. And if that wasn't enough, as I say, their own leaders weren't much fun either. So the question that was hanging around was, could this Messiah, this Jesus of Nazareth, could he deliver freedom? Could we regain our independence? Is there any hope? And just to, you probably know this already, but there were other, quote, messiahs that had turned up, most of whom come to a pretty sticky end, and very quickly. Some had run for their lives, others were just a joke. What about this one? What about this Jesus? There was a bit more to his CV looked rather better than some who'd gone before. Maybe. Shall we get our hopes up? Don't know. And so we come to a week like no other. Possibly the year 33. I'm pressing my luck there a bit. That actually is the calendar from the year 33, if you're interested. Possibly. And I've called this talk Bethany to Calvary, but we're going to go as far as Jerusalem in the first part. So let's just get our bearings here as well. We're starting in Bethany up here. That's where Jesus had some friends. Mary, Martha, Lazarus there. Simon the leper, who he healed. That's Bethany. And there's, as you can see, it's almost due east of Jerusalem over here. And it's about a mile's stroll to this little village, Bethage. We'll be mentioning that again. And then you get to, that's right on the top of the Mount of Olives. Down the Mount of Olives, there's the Garden of Gethsemane, just there. Over the valley of the Kidron. And then you're up to the city walls and the temple. And that's where a lot of the action took place. So the destination is Jerusalem. And everybody knew from the prophets, from the stories handed down, from the expectation that if anything big was going to happen, if anything was going to change, then the trigger point would be in or around Jerusalem. Yes, lots had happened elsewhere with Jesus, at different parts of the country, particularly up in the Galilee. And all that was good and fine and interesting and sometimes quite tense, sometimes quite dramatic. But that wasn't going to be the telling point. Jerusalem is where it, whatever it was going to happen. Undoubtedly. But of course, the barriers to any change, the barriers to release, to freedom, lay within that city. The Romans, the Roman garrison, there are about 600 of them based there permanently, and of course their own leadership, the chief priests, who wanted to hang on to the power they were allowed to have by the Romans. But it always came back to Jerusalem. Questions like, who's in residence? Are they favourable to us, or are they going to make things worse? Is it the godly there or the ungodly? And individuals obviously changed as to how much they intervened, intruded into the Jews' lifestyle. Not for the first time the people asked, who will lead us and free us? They looked around. There were all sorts of zealots who came with some great intentions and fell at the first fence. And that brings us to Palm Sunday, as we call it. It wasn't called it then. It was just the week before the Passover. But we know it as Palm Sunday. We're going to start at Bethany, as I say, and this is where we just do a little bit of Hebrew. The word Beth, we add an H onto it, but Beth in Hebrew means a house or a tent or a place. And you'll see that it's a very, very common in place names. If we just deal with the Bethany one, we can translate that, not terribly helpful actually. It can be translated in all sorts of ways as dates, as a house of song, house of affliction, house of response, house of misery. Don't know what you do if you put that lot together. But anyway, they all had names. There were others as well. I'll just take you through one or two names that you may recognise. Bethage, we'll come to that in a moment. That's the house of unripe figs. Bethlehem, which is the house of, anybody know? House of bread, that's it, yeah. Bethsaida, house of grace. Bethesda, house of grace. Bethsaida, the house of fish. And so it goes on. They all had names. But the house of or the place of is the consistent thing. Well, as I said earlier, Jesus was actually based in Bethany with his friends. Quite likely he'd arrived there on the Friday. That's obviously the Friday before Good Friday. Would have stayed there. Saturday he would have observed the Sabbath. And then he would set off on his journey. Short journey, just a mile down the road to Bethage, where you then step onto the mount, or you are on the Mount of Olives essentially, and you start moving down, and you go on from there. Closer look at this now, just to remind you. Here we are. This is an aerial view. Bethany, just there, a mile or so to Bethage, and then to the Mount of Olives, down into the valley, and just up into the city. Not very far at all. And so during this Holy Week, up until the Thursday evening, of course, of the Last Supper, Jesus would have been commuting, as it were, on foot that journey, just a couple of miles, all very local. It was at Bethage that the donkey and the colt were recruited, and the story there that the disciples are sent ahead. And this is a view actually from the city of Jerusalem across the... Whoops, sorry. Let's go back. There we go. There's the valley. That, I think, is the Church of All Nations. Am I right? I think I am. And there's a lovely church. This is modern day, obviously. Just there, Dominus Flavit, which is the Tears, which is a beautiful, beautiful church. But there's the Mount of Olives going up there, and that, in modern day, there's some buildings just beyond that would be the old village of Bethany, and beyond that to Bethany. So that's the sort of view you would get. This is the other way around. Here we've got the Mount of Olives. This is a rather steeper part of it. There's the valley, and there's the city. And again, this is a modern picture of it. And if we go back to that far, that is where you would come down the Mount of Olives, across, and just around the back there is a city gate where you would have gone in. So you can see the sort of terrain that it is. So, actually, I'd like to go back if I can on that. Yeah, there we are. In that shot, you'll see that it's quite a steep walk down, and as you walk down to the bottom, you actually go past the entrance to the Garden of Gethsemane. So it's all very compact. Now we can move on. So imagine that you are wandering around the outskirts of the city, and you're there for Passover. Hundreds, thousands of other people have come there as well. And you look up the Mount of Olives from the city. And as you look up, you can see that there's a group of people, perhaps not many people, maybe 20 or 30 people at that stage who are up there. Jesus and his disciples have come from Bethany. They've come to Bethany. They've picked up the donkey. No, he's got on the donkey. And they've started to move now down towards the Mount of Olives. And other people are beginning to gather. This is quite interesting. It's a bit of a novelty, this. Wonder what's going on. Who is this person? Some will know who it is. They ask around, discover it's Jesus of Nazareth. Oh, this looks interesting. Let's move on down. So they descend towards the Kidron Valley. And the numbers grow, the interest grows, the word gets around. There's a buzz going on. And it's all around this man, not everyone will know who it is, who's sitting on a donkey. And by now, Jerusalem is already buzzing. And then they see this. What is all this about? But just a little aside here. As you come down the Mount of Olives, what do you see? What do you want to see? You want to see the glorious city of Jerusalem, and in particular, most of all, you want to see the temple. That's where we want to get to. That's where you'll be going to for your sacrifices, for your worship, for all that goes on in the celebration of Passover. And what is it that stands out like a sore thumb? That monstrosity. Actually, it's a marvellous building, but to the Jewish eyes and mine, it's a monstrosity. It's the Antonia Fortress. Let me tell you about the Antonia Fortress, because this just really winds them up, believe you me. It was built in 35 BC by Herod the Great. Oh, thank you, Herod. He built umpteen fortresses and palaces and so on. It was named after, and talk about sucking up, named after Mark Antony, dedicated to him. It was courtesy of Mark Antony that Herod the Great had any power at all, because you may remember, he wasn't even Jewish. He had to convert to Judaism. The Antonia Fortress is 115 feet high. It's surrounded by this enormous ravine. It's deliberately significantly higher than the temple. its headquarters were about 600 Roman soldiers. The total number of soldiers usually within the Holy Land was about 3,000, but most of them are parked out on the coastal areas at Caesarea or up at Sepphoris in the Galilee. But there will always be at least 600, probably bolstered during the big festivals, but about 600 there. It also served as a palace so that when Pilate was there, Pontius Pilate, or whoever was the procurator at the time, they could enjoy it. And this is very significant. The priests' ceremonial robes, their vestments, as we might call them today, were in the fortress. Every day, the beginning of the day, the duty priests had to go from the temple to the fortress and say, please may we have our robes. And they would be handed over and reminded, and don't forget to bring them back at the end of the day. Just a very unsubtle reminder of who was in charge. Another not so subtle reminder was that in order to get to the temple, from the temple, which was only just adjacent to the fortress, there were two walkways like bridges across the ravine. And they were designed that you had to go up from the temple to the fortress and down coming the other way. Just a reminder, you come up to us. All these subtle, not so unsubtle reminders. So that was the Antonia fortress. Yet another reminder that you are an occupied people. You will do as you're told, and we will show you umpteen ways in which you will be subservient to us. Why were people there? They were there because of the importance of pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Here's a quote from the Old Testament, from Deuteronomy. 3 times a year, all your men must appear before the Lord your God at the place he will choose, which had become now Jerusalem, at the festival of unleavened bread, that's Passover, the Feast of Weeks, and the Feast of Tabernacles. So pilgrimage, yes, it was a call to celebrate, but also it was in obedience to God's instruction. Those 3 festivals, which they had to go to. The first one, as I say, was the Passover. That's where we're focusing, or we're moving towards that during Holy Week. Pesha in Hebrew, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, going right back, remembered, to when they had to use everything up and then mark the doors with blood so that the angel of death would pass over when they were being released from slavery in Egypt. And the whole Exodus story followed from that. There was the wheat harvest. That was the Shavuot, the Feast of Weeks at Pentecost. Pentecost is an old name. We now associate Pentecost, of course, with the coming of the Holy Spirit. Then it was a festival, 50 days, hence the Penti, that's the 50, Pentecost, 50 days after the Passover. And that's when they had the wheat harvest. There were 2 other harvests, regular harvests, as it were. One was the barley harvest, which came a little bit later, a couple of months later, and then the fruit harvest a little bit later from that. And the third of the major festivals was the Feast of Booths, which really was another harvest, how it was celebrated, but it remembered also the wandering which came to an end in the Promised Land. So there's the pilgrimage. The visit to Jerusalem at Passover, it was the greatest desire, but it was the unfulfilled dream of so many. From Galilee, the journey was long, it was dangerous, and it was costly. Just to give you one example of what was entailed. In the first century, the Jews were the most taxed people ever known. There were 7 different taxes they had to pay, 4 to the secular authorities, that's the Romans, and 3 to the temple. Even the poor were only able to retain 20% of their income. So when the Chancellor of the Exchequer gives his budget in a few weeks' time, just thank your lucky stars. Mind you, I don't know what he's got in store. Maybe, I don't know. I hope not 20%. The most resented of all of these taxes was the frontier tax. Because remember right at the beginning, I was showing the different regions, the Decapolis, Perea, Galilee, and Samaria, and so on, where every time you passed through or from one of those, let's call them counties or states to another, you paid a tax. And you would meet up with a tax collector, whose name might be Zacchaeus, or it might be Matthew. And they held franchises, courtesy of the Romans. So, for example, they may say, okay, you're the highest bidder, you will pay us 3,000 denarii a month. And so you had to earn at least 3,000, because until you'd learnt to earn 3,000, you hadn't got anything for yourself. So the prices varied, and probably towards the end of the month, as they're a bit short, the prices went up. Otherwise, I won't get any bread on my table. That's how it worked. That is why they were hated. They were not allowed to be witnesses in court. They were that despised. And I believe they're amongst those that weren't allowed to enter synagogues for worship, along with the lepers and others like shepherds, sheep minders, I must be careful, sheep minders. There were certain classes, if you like, that could not meet with the others. We're going to be picking up afterwards more about the anticipation of Passover. But we really need a cup of tea now, don't we? Let's take a break.